verses 1 through 16. This translation comes to us from The Voice, which is a newer translation. Now Adam and Eve discovered the pleasures of lovemaking, and soon Eve conceived and gave birth to a son whom they named Cain. Eve said, "Look, I have created a new human, a male child, with the help of the Eternal." Eve went on to give birth to Cain's brother, Abel. Abel grew up to be a shepherd, and Cain grew up to be a farmer. After he had learned how to produce food from the fields, Cain gave the Eternal One an offering, some of the crops he had grown from the ground. For his part of the offering, Abel gave God some tender lamb meat, the choicest cuts from the firstborn of his flock. The Eternal One accepted Abel and his gift of lamb, but did not regard Cain and what Cain presented. Because of this, Cain became extremely angry, and his countenance fell. The Eternal One saw this and said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why do you look so despondent? Don't you know that as long as you do what is right, then I accept you? But if you do not do what is right, watch out, because sin is crouching at your door, ready to pounce on you. You must master your anger before your anger masters you." Jealousy is eating at Cain's heart, and left unattended, it begins to consume him. And so Cain spoke to his brother Abel. When they were in the field, Cain's envy of his brother got the best of him. He attacked and killed Abel. The Eternal One said to Cain, "Where is your brother?" Cain responded, "I have no idea. Am I supposed to be responsible for where he goes and what he does? Am I my brother's keeper?" The Eternal One said to Cain, "What have you done? Listen, I can hear the voice of your brother's blood crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed, cut off from the ground that opened up and received your brother's innocent blood, spilled by your own murderous hand. From now on, when you till the ground, it will no longer yield for you its strength and nourishment. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer of the earth." Cain said, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you have banned me from the soil and hidden me from your presence. I will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and anyone who meets me will want to kill me." The Eternal One said, "That is not the case. Whoever kills you will suffer my vengeance and pay the penalty 7 times. Then God put a special mark on Cain so that no one who came in contact with him would try to kill him. Then Cain went away from the Eternal's presence and settled in the land of Nod, a place for wanderers, to the east of Eden. The word of God. Whew. There are some scriptures that do not make it into the 3-year lectionary cycle. Would you be surprised to know that this is one of them that didn't make the cut? hard texts to preach. So we are in the second week of this worship series following the theme of this little book, Questions God Asks Us. In the Bible, this book is written by Reverend Trevor Hudson. The first two questions come from the book of Genesis. Last week we looked at the question God asks Adam and Eve in the garden after eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God asks them, "Where are you?" when they are hiding. Now they are banished from the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve took God's directive to be fruitful and multiply and produced two sons, Cain and Abel. And the question God asks in this passage of Genesis 4 is, "Where is your brother?" So I want to focus for a moment on how we interpret these foundational stories in the Bible, in the Hebrew scriptures. Whether we interpret them from a literal point of view or we examine them from a different lens. Contemporary theologian and one of my teachers in the faith, Marcus Borg, wrote a book almost 30 years ago, Reading the Bible Again for the First Time. I imagine many of you have this book on your shelf at home. He offers a way to examine the Bible with an alternative to the literal, factual interpretation of the Bible that we hear from churches around us. And offers a historical, metaphorical interpretation, which focuses on what the texts meant in their ancient historical contexts. The ancient people did not expect these stories to be read as either scientific or literal accounts, and most of these stories were not captured until centuries after they occurred. Metaphorical interpretation is grounded in the recognition that much of the language of the Bible employs metaphorical, symbolic meaning, but this does not diminish their value. These stories focus on the metaphorical understanding, focuses on the meaning of the story and what they were trying to convey to their communities. What we need to remember is that biblical stories often have multiple layers of meaning. And so we can allow these more than literal stories to illuminate deeper truth within our lives for today. So this story from Genesis 4 offers the epitome of dysfunctional family, sibling rivalry, as well as toxic masculinity. Cain became a farmer, Abel became a shepherd. The story begins with the two brothers coming to worship, to make an offering to God from their life's work. Cain presents a few vegetables and grain from his farm. Abel slaughters a lamb from his flock and makes a sacrifice of it. Instead of praising and accepting both offerings, what does God do? The way it's written, God is pleased with Abel and his sacrifice, but Cain's offering is not regarded by God. It doesn't say that God refused Cain's offering, but it's not regarded. God doesn't pay any attention to Cain's offering. God's behavior is somewhat more difficult to analyze than Cain's. We know that humans are capable of doing bad things, but at least I expect better from God. God's preference for Abel's offering is not explained in Genesis. It leaves us, at least me, with more questions. I don't know, was God more of a carnivore than a vegetarian? Did God like the smell of meat more than cooked vegetables? To my understanding, God acts like a flawed human parent by not showing equal love. If you have if you are not an only child and you have siblings, most of the siblings would point to, oh, that was dad's favorite, that was mom's favorite, and it may or may not be the truth, but that's our perspective. Of course, in my family, they all said that I was the favorite. I would disagree. But most parents, at least they attempt, do they not, to show equal love. God should have realized that favoring the offering of one brother over the other was going to pit them against each other and be a perfect setup for competition, sibling rivalry, and make the slighted one jealous. We can see in this short passage that the first emotion Cain felt, well, it says it was anger, and then Cain's countenance fell. In my experience and in study, there is usually something that precedes, there is an emotion that precedes anger, that we don't get to anger first. What often precedes anger is hurt, disappointment, expectations not met. So in the same sentence, it says that Cain was angry and his countenance fell. I think his countenance fell first. His ego was hurt. Anger is often a secondary emotion. Can you remember a time when you were disappointed? It happens young. We may not even remember the first time. Can you remember a time when you were not regarded by another or felt left out? That happened young as well. 3rd grade. Oh. Definitely junior high. Overlooked. You know when they had captains out at recess for PE? Some people were always the captain. I was never the captain. Who was always the captain? Are you going to admit it? Oh, there are a few of you. Okay. All right. Well, I was here like back and forth. Oh. And hoping to be picked before the last one, right? Whew. I know this is, some of these questions, it evokes stuff within us. I mean, for me, even thinking about it takes me back a ways when you felt humiliated, shamed, overlooked. When you were hurt by someone, and especially someone you loved and you thought they loved you, and they probably did, but and then that hurt gets manifest sometimes, and we begin to distance ourselves from that person. So Cain was angry, his countenance fell, and God steps in and questions. God has another question in here. If Cain has the right to be upset, God asks, why are you angry? It's like, really, God? You're asking why? Why has your countenance fallen? God picks up on that cue. And then offers a bit of wisdom, teaching. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, well, sin is lurking at your door. Its desire for you. You need to master your anger. God appears to say, get over it, deal with it, and buck up and get a hold of your anger. God offers the wisdom of processing hurt, although Scripture doesn't tell us like that. But process those emotions, process your hurt so that it doesn't lead to anger so that you don't begin to hurt others. Because there's a saying, hurt people hurt people. Did Cain listen? I don't think so. This text is not just about sibling rivalry, but about the disastrous consequences of feeling unworthy. Whether Cain was unworthy in God's sight or not, he felt unworthy and humiliated because his offering is not acceptable, and in turn he feels unacceptable. So in a fit of rage, of feeling unworthy before God, what does he do? He lures his brother away. This is the first recorded case of sibling rivalry, of jealousy so intense that it leads to murder. Hurt and disappointment, humiliation, competition, and jealousy can absolutely lead to anger and resentment, bitterness, and violence. Was not just true for Cain and Abel, it is true for us, for humanity. Conflict, division, and estrangement are central elements in this story of Cain and Abel, this narrative. And it echoes throughout the Bible, and it continues today. I think Tom's prayer was getting at this sense as well. It's the story of humanity. God comes looking for Cain and asks, "Where is your brother?" What an odd question for God to ask. God already knew. He said, "Why did you do it, Cain?" Instead, God asks, "Where is your brother?" Just like the first question God asks Adam and Eve, "Where are you?" was not about physical location. Neither is this question. It's not about literal physical location of where Abel is. These are spiritual questions. When God asks, "Where is your brother?" God is not asking a literal question. The question goes to the core of who Cain is. It goes to the core of who we are. It's greater than the literal facts of this specific family dynamic and dysfunction. God gives Cain a moment to do the next right thing. But sadly, Cain's response is said in anger. "How should I know? How should I know what my brother is up to? How should I know what he is doing, where he is? He's trying to hide like his parents hid in the bushes." Just as Adam and Eve hid, Cain tries to hide from God as well. And then he asks the rhetorical question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Some of us may want to shout, "Yes, Cain, you are. You are your brother's keeper. You are supposed to take care of him. You're supposed to love him." Take accountability for your actions, Cain. Come clean before God with an open heart. Tell God what happened, what you did. But Cain, in this moment, was not sorry, nor did he show remorse for killing Abel. But later, he is sorry that God confronted him and that he was forced to suffer the consequences of his evil deed. He lamented that God's punishment was greater than he could bear. And in this moment, God has mercy for Cain, and God places a mark. I don't know what the mark is on Cain. I don't know why I'm pointing to my forehead. But places a mark on Cain. Maybe it's not even a literal mark. so that no one will take his life. And Cain went away from God's presence and settled in the land of Nod, a place for wanderers, to the east of Eden. Symbolically, going east in the Bible is moving away from God's presence. So in a sense, we're moving away from this story and moving into the relevance for our lives. We all live in the land east of Eden, and we can choose to move away from or toward God's presence in every moment of our lives. And we might struggle with the question, the ambiguous question, am I my brother's keeper? Well, we may not have done anything like what Cain did to hurt our neighbor. And we, unlike Cain, may have taken full accountability of when we have hurt others, even when it's hard. Taking accountability, I think it's always hard, isn't it? To get to that soft place in the core of our heart and to recognize I didn't intend to do it, or maybe if I did intend to do it, either way, oh, I caused pain. I'm sorry. That vulnerability. So we may take accountability for our actions, but there is this tension that remains. In one sense, we are not our brother's keeper. Each of us is a free and independent agent, able to make decisions on our own, and we can pretend that we have no responsibility for others. It's none of our business. They're suffering, for the most part, they brought it on themselves. We can justify it. Or even if I did help, it wouldn't make a difference. Our actions may have nothing to do with what has happened to our neighbor. But in another sense, we do bear responsibility. Reverend Trevor Hudson writes, our lives are deeply bound up with one another. Whether we acknowledge it or not, our actions do affect those around us. So a bit of my personal story, and I will return again and again to my childhood. So you'll get to know my life in my childhood pretty well. Just a glimpse today, though. I have 5 older brothers. Take that in. Yeah. Ranging in age from 4 to 13 years older than me, and they all took turns taking care of me. I was left in their care. They were my keeper, literally my keeper, and they bore responsibility for me because my parents placed me in their care with varying degrees of success, but I am still here. And the fact that I came out of it alive and relatively unscathed is a remarkable feat. We grew up near the Wishkah River. Anyone know where the Wishkah River is? It's in Aberdeen, and you only know Aberdeen because you stop for gas or a quick snack on your way to Westport or Ocean Shores or the Olympic Peninsula. Are you with me now? You kind of have a sense. The Wishkah flows into the Chehalis River. So the Wishkah River flooded our road several times a year. There was the main country road, and then we were a spur, and it was flooded several times a year, and probably more than that now. My brother Joe is 6 years older than me, or was 6 years older than me, and I remember clearly when I was in kindergarten how Joe gave me a piggyback ride the whole half mile up the spur of our road. A half mile is a long way for a 6th grader to be carrying his kindergarten sister, although I was a lot littler then. Because the bus driver let us out in the flooded road. And he carried me piggyback all the way home. Joe's character was gentle and kind. But about 13 or 14 years old, his life path led him down the road of addiction. Addiction runs in my family. On both sides, there are alcoholic uncles and aunts. And Joe spent frequent time in jail for petty crimes, and he self-destructed. And by the time he was in high school, he promised my dad, before my dad died, that he would graduate from high school. But my dad died Joe's senior year in high school. He didn't finish. By that time, he was addicted to pot and alcohol, and he became a homeless alcoholic for the rest of his short life, preferring to sleep on the cold ground instead of a soft, warm bed. As a teenager and into my 20s, I vacillated between pity, anger, disgust, compassion, depending on the day. Joe did lots of things that caused harm. He broke my piggy bank and stole the contents of dollar bills and nickels, dimes, and quarters that I'd saved up when I was 9, 10 years old. Took money out of my purse when I was older, did all kinds of things. And I didn't have much compassion on those days. But later there were times when I would return to Aberdeen, where he still lived, out on the street, and I would recognize his familiar saunter. Do you know how you can recognize somebody's walk from their gait from a long way away? And I'd say, oh my gosh, that's Joe. I'm from behind, and compassion would kick in, and I would pull over and take him to go get something to eat. Fast forward, March 2005. I was in Spokane for a clergy transition gathering from being the associate pastor at Marysville with Reverend Tom Albright to being appointed to Snoqualmie. That was the timing. And I received word that Joe was in Spokane too. He had been beat up on the street. He'd been left for dead. Someone found him and took him to Sacred Heart Providence Hospital, where they performed surgery and they nursed him back to life for the next 6 weeks. I went to visit him while I was in Spokane, slurring his words either from the traumatic brain injury or from a lifetime of drinking, or both. We had a conversation and he said, I should have been left for dead. There was a brief moment where I confess I was conflicted with mixed feelings. How much intervention for someone who had been in and out of alcohol rehab dozens of times and just ended up back on the streets. Someone who could easily be cast aside. But the bigger memories took over of when I was a child and the kindness and the gentleness of his soul, recognizing that it really was the core of who Joe was. 3 months later, he was living with my mother and in her trailer home and choosing to sleep on the floor instead of a bed because that's what he was used to. But it was June 2005 during annual conference at Mason United Methodist Church where I was ordained. And while serving communion, I recognized a familiar saunter coming up my line to receive communion, swaggering his way up as he used to do. gaunt. I hardly recognized him. And with tears streaming down both of our faces, I recognized the moment of grace. I am my brother's keeper. And I'm so thankful for that moment. And some of the moments after, before Joe succumbed to liver cancer and liver disease in 2009, just 4 years later, and died at the age of 48. In what ways are we to be our brother's keeper? When do we intervene? When do we reach out in compassion to shine a light when our brother, our sister, our sibling has lost their way? There are countless stories of how people choose not to get involved, to be responsible, and how lives are harmed because of it. And countless other times when people did choose to be their brother's keeper and they saved a life. I've had several opportunities to hear Father Greg Boyle speak. He was a frequent speaker at Catholic Healthcare Assembly, which I attended with Angie when she worked for Providence Hospital as the Chief Mission Integration Officer. And so Father Boyle, if you do not know him or have heard of him, he's been a priest in Los Angeles for over 30 years in one of the most violent and gang-ridden neighborhoods in LA. And he's the founder and executive director of Homeboy Industries, a nonprofit organization that not only hires gang members and addicts, but also gives them a healing place to discover their dignity, their self-worth. And he holds a mirror up to people to return them to themselves, to the core of who they are as a beloved child of God. He wrote amazing books. One of them is Tattoos on the Heart. Another is Barking to the Choir, The Power of Radical Kinship. Father Boyle had us laughing hysterically at one moment with tears streaming down our faces the next. Father Boyle started with a true story of how a gang member came into his office and said, they called him G, Father Greg, or G, and said, G, when you go out to preach a sermon, you have to fill your speech with self-defecation. Now, Father Boyle, he's a priest, he's a preacher, he's a speaker, he's written books. And he responded, and I have to ask your forgiveness for his response, and Katie, I need your jar. I need your bad word jar for Edward. Father G, when you go out there and preach, when you speak, you have to fill your speech with self-defecation. And he responds, no shit. But he also told us story after story about how gang members who had feuded against each other for years became kin, became friends, and he left us with these words. The measure of our service is not about how much compassion we have for one another. It is about our willingness to become kin for one another. It is about our ability not to extend compassion, but our willingness to be reached, to be touched by another's life, to stand in awe of what burdens people have to carry and not in judgment of how they carry it. To stand in awe of what burdens people have to carry and not in judgment of how they carry it. Am I my brother's keeper? The question, where is your brother, takes us as far and as wide as our hearts will stretch. Is our sister the mother across the world who longs for safety for her children, will travel hundreds and thousands of miles to get it? Is our brother someone of a different political party with vastly different understandings of truth? We are not responsible for the decisions another makes, but we have a responsibility to care with concern. Where is your brother, your sister, your sibling, your neighbor? God asks the question. Desmond Tutu says, my humanity is bound up with yours, for we can only be human together. Mark Twain, with his brutal wit, said it a little bit more ironically. The Bible tells us to love our neighbors and also love our enemies, probably because they are generally the same people. Back in 2016, when Angie and I were attending the ceremony for the Catholic Healthcare Association, the assembly, one program was chosen out of at least 30 nominated. It was a transitional respite care for the homeless program to provide better care than the revolving emergency room ever had resources to provide. It was staffed with nurses, social workers, and mental health providers. The respite started 10 years ago in November 2013 with just one bed in the shelter, and now there are beds for at least 24 recuperating homeless patients. You might wonder where this program is located. It is Providence Sacred Heart Hospital in Spokane, the very same hospital in 2005 who looked at my homeless, alcoholic, beat up brother Joe and said, I am my brother's keeper.